Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to show you how I built these storage tanks and my struggles along the way. I'd had 3 yogurt drink pots in my recycling pile for ages, and I decided they'd look great as storage tanks. I measured them up and bashed out some very rough sketches, and headed into Illustrator to create the templates. This all coincided nicely with the delivery of 0.25mm styrene I'd been waiting to try out on my Cricut Explore 3. I ran a few tests and settled on 2 passes of max pressure, which did the trick nicely. The cuts came out really well, but still needed the odd bit of extra work. The holes on these uprights were very small and needed a good poke to get them out. A little time consuming, but I got the bonus of getting loads of great little circles to use as rivets or studs on other projects. After the general cleanup, I laid everything out and took a look. Everything seemed like it would all go together and lined up really well. Gluing was a little tricky. My design relied quite a bit on 3 layers lining up really perfectly, so the pressure was on not to mess it up so badly I prevented the other parts from fitting later. As it turned out, I did a really solid job of lining it up and gluing it together, but got scuppered by a bit of a limitation of cutting styrene in the Cricut. The slots on the sides of the uprights had ended up being cut with a slight taper towards the end that made them too narrow to slot in properly. Again, sorting this out was easy enough with a sharp knife, but if I cut this sort of thing in styrene on the Cricut again, I'd make these slots more oversized than I already had. Once the slots were fitting nicely, the uprights were glued into the frame. This was made more difficult by the wobbliness of the styrene. This was my first time really working with it, and I'd expected 3 layers, all welded together with plastic glue, to be a little more rigid. It's definitely something to keep in mind if I ever work with styrene again in this way. I continued getting all the main structure glued into place before adding my standard nail art beads until I was happy it looked suitably industrial. Now, as a bonus part of the video, here's a look at some other bits I did when I cut out the parts of this build, and which I think are much better uses of styrene on the Cricut. These are base toppers and stencils, and I think they're pretty great. Next, I moved on to the base. I wanted these tanks to sit on top of a large concrete base. For this, I used a chunk of 1-inch reclaimed insulation foam. I've got piles of this stuff, all liberated from skips I spot on my travels. I placed the frame on top and traced out the indents to lower the yogurt pots into the foam for a little more structural integrity. I used a combination of tools and got a good groove for each pot lid. Then I dry fitted and checked they were right before gluing the frame and the pots into place. I was really in 2 minds about doing it this way. Ideally, I'd have liked to have painted the pots separately and inserted them later. In hindsight, I probably could have done that, but at the time I hadn't quite worked out what I wanted to do next, so I just decided to deal with that problem later. Once the glue was dry, I felt it was fine, but it needed something and I didn't know what. So the build sat in that state for quite a while, until I had a bit of a brainwave. I'd been waiting to try something out and I finally had the perfect guinea pig. These are micro irrigation pipes, and although they require a little work to make them really useful, I think they're worth it. They come in big packs with all sorts of angles and joints and are cheap as chips. You need to clip off the ends the pipe goes over, and if you want a really good fitting for a 3mm rod, you'll need to use a 3mm drill bit to widen out the inner diameter. I think you'll agree, with a bit of 3mm aluminium wire, they work so well and are my favourite hobby find for ages. I also use one of the nozzles for the tank valve at the front of the build, using more wire as a bit of an anchor to secure it in place in the foam, and of course added some more rivets. After this, I PVA'd a little sand onto the attachments into the base to show build-up of dust and debris at the base of the tanks and frame. Once the glue had dried, I gave the whole thing a coat of grey primer through the airbrush, and once I'd put everything away and thought about it properly, I really regretted it, and felt so annoyed the build once again ended up sitting on the shelf waiting for me to get back to it. This is where I got so miserable about the build, I decided to do some work on it off camera to see if I could save it. You see, the thing that was so stupid about priming in darkish grey is that I'd always, from the start, planned on making the tanks yellow, and now Not only were they really fiddly to paint, but I had the challenge of painting a large area of yellow over a dark colour. What I should have done is prime it again in white, but instead I decided to try and battle it. I ended up being quite happy with the concrete, but had quite a lot of back and forth with the metal. I had such a struggle with motivation, I'd lost a clear vision of what I really wanted, and kept changing my mind. Anyway, eventually I got some, albeit patchy yellow down, and started to feel moderately more optimistic about the build, and got on with filming again. I didn't have the time or the space to get the airbrush out, but I wanted to test out the stencils I'd cut, so I decided to see how well they'd work with stippled paint. The answer, as you can see, is not terrible, but not great. In the end, I used a mix of stencils and freehand to add a variety of signage and graffiti, before adding in some sponged and brushed chipping, followed by some rusty orange ink and a liberal amount of recess wash. All this helped, as did some moss, but I still don't feel happy with it as a whole. I mean, I don't think it's terrible, but it's just a bit unsatisfying, aside from the pipes discovery. And I think some of that comes down to how I feel I've wasted the styrene on something I didn't end up painting as well as I'd liked. There have been some valuable lessons that I couldn't have learnt any other way, so I consider that positive. I think in future I'll stick to serial packet card, and save the styrene for where it really shines. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this and learnt some lessons with me along the way. See you next time, YouTube.